Hello and welcome. This is a Public Affairs Forum sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. My name is Luther Elmore. We hold these forums every Sunday here at our church location, 4700 Grover Avenue. We invite you to come and join us where you can view the presentations in person and ask questions of your own. These forums have been held since 1954, the year this church first incorporated. The purpose of them is to fulfill the mission of the church, to nourish souls, transform lives, and do justice. We would invite you, if you need additional information about the forums, then please go to our church website, austinuu.org. To introduce our speaker for the day, we have one of our conscientious and long-serving members of the Forum Committee, Ms. Bonnie Gardner. Bonnie?
Thank you, Luther. Good morning, everybody. You're in for a real treat today. I want to introduce Dr. James Galbraith, and he will be speaking on government in the time of Trump and also populism inequality in the 2016 election. He's going to be talking about the workings of government in the Trump era and the challenges, threats, and opportunities posed by growing economic inequality and changes in our labor markets. I could go on and on about his achievements and credentials, but he insisted on editing his biographical sketch. So he currently holds the Lloyd Benson Chair in Government Business Relations and is a professor in government at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He holds degrees from Harvard and Yale. He served in several staff positions in Congress in his earlier years. He currently directs the University of Texas Inequality Project, an informal research group based at the LBJ School. He is continuing the tradition of his father, John Kenneth Galbraith, a distinguished agricultural economist. He's a passionate researcher of issues of social and economic inequality and their implications for our country, and he's a political commentator of note. His most recent book is Welcome to the Poison Chalice, The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe. That's 2016. Other recent books are Inequality and Instability, A Study of the World Economy Just Before the Great Crisis, 2012. A prior book is The Predator State, How Conservatives Abandoned the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. That's 2008. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Jamie Galbraith. Thank you.
Well, Bonnie, thank you very much, and thank you for coming out. It's always a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to share some thoughts with you. I thank you for that very kind introduction, although I have to say I'm mixed feelings about having it acknowledged openly that I'm no longer in my earlier years. And as for my father and his intellectual origins, he told my wife many years ago that he started in agriculture and found it detestable. And so he switched to agricultural economics, and he found that was detestable too, so he just dropped the agriculture altogether and went on with the economics. My theme today is government in the time of Trump. I chose something that I knew would cheer you up, although I take it it's possible that this audience is not overwhelmingly the most steadfast group of supporters that the president currently enjoys. But my remarks are, of course, strictly nonpartisan. I want to begin by just a little bit of a discussion of how we got to this point and to this juncture in our political life. and in particular to connect two phenomena, one which clearly characterized the 2016 campaign, and I think in many ways determined its outcome, which was the rise of a sentiment that's described often as populism, is characterized by an alienation, a disaffection, an anger, a sense of not being in control of the institutions and policies of the government, sentiment which was clearly present and which Mr. Trump was able to capitalize on in a way that Hillary Clinton could not. And on the other hand, a question which I have been studying as a matter of economics and economic statistics and measurement for many years, which is this question of economic inequality. What is the relationship between the two? It's a question which is interesting, I think, in and of itself, and leads to an intuitive judgment that the rise in inequality, which we all know has occurred, has fostered resentment, which played into the hands of the winning candidate in the last election. But in what way did it do so? And how can we understand it in light of the fact that, as we all know, American elections are not decided by popular vote. And in fact, the popular vote in this election went quite decisively for Mrs. Clinton, thanks primarily to a very, very large majority in the state of California, but nevertheless, the popular vote is what it is. Whereas the election was decided constitutionally by the outcome in the Electoral College, which is winner take all on a state-by-state basis. And that's the way we do elections, for better or for worse. So when thinking about the relationship between the election outcome and inequality, if there is one has to translate the analysis to the state level. And that posed a little challenge for us as a research group. Myself and my students, calling us a research group is a little grand, but I do have the assistance of some very capable students. And what they did was to calculate some numbers that had not been available, which is inequality of incomes, pay and incomes, for each state in each year going back to 1969. And you might think, well, we must have those numbers, but we didn't, because some states are very small and the samples were just too small to make reliable calculations, except at the decennial census. So we had the numbers every 10 years, but we didn't have them annually. The work that we've done has shown that it's really not difficult to derive very reliable measures of what was going on from year to year, and that enables you to say, okay, what changed from year X to year Y, and did this have a bearing on the way the election turned out? Well, it turns out that it did. This is a map of, I'm sure many of you have seen it, it's the standard map by county of the outcome of the election, with the red counties indicating those that went Republican, and the blue counties those that went Democratic. So you can see a little bit about how things played out across the country, but it doesn't get to an answer of the question that I was just posing. To what extent does change in inequality in each state affect the outcome? The way to do that is to calculate those changes and then compare them to the Clinton or the Trump margins in the election, and that's done for the 1988 election, so Democrat, Republican. In this slide that I'm showing you now, Michael Dukakis won the states designated by blue triangles. George H.W. Bush won those designated by red circles. It was a year in which Bush won a big victory, but you can also see, and on the horizontal axis, I should say, the change in inequality as we measure it. Vertical axis, the Democratic share. Well, you can see there's nothing to look at there. There's no relationship. This is not a phenomenon which bore on the 88 election, the difference in inequality from 69 to 88. And I could take you through the subsequent elections and you would see that it does change, but I'll just skip, since I don't want to spend all my time on this, to the 2016 election, and that's the picture. And there you can see there is a dramatic relationship between the change in inequality in each state from 1990 to 2014 and the outcome of the 2016 election. And what is that relationship? Well, the most important fact about it is that the 14 states with the largest increase in inequality, every single one of them voted for Hillary Clinton. Every one. Right? And the states with the smaller increases in inequality predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly voted for Donald Trump. Right? So it tells a story about our politics, and the thing we have to ask is, what is that story? Is this capturing something? It is capturing something, but what exactly is it capturing? I don't think it's capturing people's reactions to inequality. I think it's capturing some facts about the political geography of the country. In the states that Mrs. Clinton won, including very large states, and I have the list of them here so you can see, New York, New Jersey, out to the far right, California, Maryland, Massachusetts, Hawaii, Rhode Island, Nevada, District of Columbia. What are those states? They are large states, some of them smaller, but they are states characterized by two population groups that together generally form a plurality. And the two population groups are wealthy urban professionals who tend to be liberals and vote for the Democrats, and substantial populations that are minority, that are African American, Hispanic, immigrant, who form a loyal but Democratic base, but one which does not generally share in power when the Democrats are in office. And when those two things together, those two groups are in majority, that's a democratic state. That's the world in which we live. And the Republican states are states where those two groups are not predominant. They're present, but they don't form a majority. States which are more rural, more suburban, more white, less wealthy urban professional, less Democratic minority. And those states, including the one in which we live here in Texas, tend to vote Republican. And this pattern, this is not a new pattern, it was a very pronounced pattern, but it was true in the Bush-Kerry election, it was true in the Bush-Gore election. It's characteristically true in American politics these days. So what's going on? Why did Mr. Trump, why was he able to turn this into a victory? I suggest two things. One was a campaign of resentment directed at government by entitled and highly educated know-it-alls, people like me. Okay, I'm a little too, let's say, unorthodox to be included in that particular ruling strata, but all of my contemporaries are there. Ivy League educated types who live in the, in the eastern cities or out in the West Coast, and who feel that they can go in and out of government without ever having a political base, without ever connecting to any broader population. Right? That's very much, if you look at it, the way the Democratic Party has been functioning for a long time. And so it's not surprising, as I often say, when I'm addressing or trying to reach my colleagues and contemporaries who form part of this group, that in the immortal words of Pogo, we have met the enemy, and he is us. This is what is going on. A rebellion, the populist rebellion, was a rebellion against a form of professional rule. And Donald Trump took very clear, very direct advantage of it. And the other piece, which we are also familiar with, was both the drop in the enthusiasm of the minority vote, given that Barack Obama was no longer on the ballot, but also suppression of that vote by ID laws and other mechanisms, making it harder for African Americans and harder for immigrants to vote. And I suspect also the disruption of their communities by the foreclosure frauds of recent years also has made an effect. But in any effect, when you drive down those two elements, or you have resentment against one and suppression of the other, then you're going to tilt the election toward the Republicans. Well, as we all know, we've now been living for 9 months under what was represented to us as a all-Republican government. Republican control of the White House, of both houses of Congress, of the Supreme Court, certainly. And one of the things that's most interesting about it is what's not happening. If you follow the campaign and the president's inaugural address and his first address to the Congress, there was one theme that always came up first as his highest priority, and that was infrastructure. That was rebuilding America. That was the substantial content of America First. Excuse me, but where's the bill? Right? Even a corrupt bill intended to enrich highway contractors, real estate developers, and Trump's friends. Excuse me, where is it? Well, it hasn't happened. And I believe it didn't happen because I believe the Republican leadership in the Congress told the president-elect before he even was inaugurated that they weren't interested and it wasn't going to happen. Why weren't they interested? Go back to the geography. Where is the infrastructure? Where are the water system? Where are the streets? Where is the all of the heavy investment in these areas which has been neglected since the 1970s? It's in the cities. How do the cities vote? They don't vote for Republicans. So there's basically no constituency interest in an activity which is primarily going to benefit citizens of the other party. Bush didn't care about this so much when he went into Iraq. He enriched the homeowners of the area around the District of Columbia, the Maryland and Virginia suburbs, all of whom voted for Democrats to an extraordinary extent by military spending and so on. That was heavily concentrated there. But these guys are a little more, let's say, principled. What else isn't happening? What else did the president promise that he hasn't delivered? Well, we have a negotiation going on over the North American Free Trade Agreement. Can anybody tell me what the American position is in that negotiation? I see lots of heads and all of them are going like this. Right? I couldn't tell you. I'm sure there are some things, because they want to be able to say, well, we renegotiated the agreement. But are we going to get major trade protection that would restore the industrial base of the upper Midwestern states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that Trump narrowly carried? Of course we're not. Why not? Because that would restore the unionized workforce and the Democratic vote, and guess what? They wouldn't be Republican states afterwards. And you think the people from the rural districts of Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania who control those states don't understand that? Of course they do. And what would happen, do you suppose, right here in Texas, if there was a massive drive to cut off trade with Mexico? Yes, exactly. Do you think the global business elites, who are Republican in this state, would like that? I think they would not. And so that also isn't going to happen. Some symbolic gestures. Some things that are quite unpleasant, including the effect of immigration enforcement and ICE on the immigrant communities. But disruption of trade, I'll believe it when I see it. And then there's the question of what they've tried over the first 6 months and 8 months, actually, of the administration until just a few weeks ago. And there, the most important single thing is surely the effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act, to repeal Obamacare. And that's also a very interesting experience. It tells us something about the deep politics of the red states, at least of some of them. Those states are not, generally speaking, the most prosperous states. They're not where the wealthiest people in our country live. Some of them are, plenty of wealthy people here. But in a state which was crucial, which is solidly Republican, namely the state of Alaska, it turns out that a large share, the number I read, I believe, was 2/3, but it might be inaccurate, of the population of that state's Medicaid eligible. That does not necessarily mean that they're poor in the sense that the Medicaid definition, is intended to cover, because at least they're low income. Alaska's a beautiful place. People live there with low incomes for a reason, but they become eligible for a federal program, which I'm entirely in favor of their having access to. And when they have that eligibility, it's a benefit they recognize and which they do not wish to give up. And so the Republican senator from that state, Susan Murkowski, was unwilling to cast the decisive vote. And probably if it hadn't been her, it might have been someone else who would have played that role. Right? Because there's always in the Congress a tension between lining up with your leadership and serving your constituents. And everybody understands that you get a free pass on a certain number of things. You're expected to fall in line on a certain number of things. The other thing that didn't happen so far are the massive spending cuts in the federal budget that were widely expected. And why didn't it happen? Why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because it turns out the Republican Party is not unified on the question of the debt ceiling. There are some who believe that the government should continue to function and others who believe it shouldn't. This is a pretty basic divide inside a political party, but it means it's not possible to get an increase in the debt ceiling on Republican lines. And so the president turned in his meeting to Chuck Schumer, my Harvard classmate, by the way, 2 years ahead of me, and Nancy Pelosi, and said, I'll take your deal. And what they said was, we'll give you 3 months. Not because they didn't think the debt ceiling should be raised for 18 months or however long, but because 3 months means they're cut in on the next negotiation and the one after that and the one after that. And so they went out a little dazed, but certainly smiling, that in spite of the fact that they're the minority in both houses, they had the leverage on this question and therefore could ask for the hurricane relief, which is coming into Texas now, as part of, as well as other things in the federal budget that would just continue as they have been rather than being subject to draconian cuts. The next thing on the agenda is the tax cut. And that's a very complex topic, and I'm just going to take up a handful of things about it. My time on Capitol Hill came in the early 1980s. In the Reagan administration, I was obviously in the opposition as staff director of the Joint Economic Committee. But one of the most remarkable things that happened in that period was that a tax bill prepared by the Democratic tax leaders in Congress, Bill Bradley of New Jersey, Dick Gephardt of Missouri, became, over the course of a peculiar political transition in 1984, the Reagan tax bill, and ultimately the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which was enacted with the strong support of Dan Rostenkowski, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee at the time, and so forth. So this was a bill which is echoed very strongly in the income tax provisions, at least as they're advertised, of the proposed Trump tax cut. Its philosophy was rich people take a lot of deductions, so they don't actually pay very high marginal rates. And if you cause them to report those exemptions and so forth as income, you can tax it all at a lower rate, get the same revenue, and it's fairer. It's not a bad philosophy. It was one which greatly aggravated liberals in the 1980s, but it was not, given what happened to the tax code, it wasn't entirely wrong. It did have some very strong consequences, which, if I were doing it over, I would have certainly been more aware of in retrospect than we were before. One of them was that when you reduce the personal income tax rates, you induce corporate leaders to pay themselves directly as income what they were previously taking as perks. And they were previously buying themselves country club memberships and corporate jets and penthouses in the corporate headquarters and all kinds of things, vacations and so forth, meetings in nice places, as part of the benefits of being a corporate executive and charging that off against the corporate income. When you reduce their income tax from 70 to 35% or whatever it is, they said, oh, well, we'll just take this as cash income, buy our own country club memberships, and have the money built up for our children. And that was a consequence of the 86 Act. Something that we're living with today. It shows up in the emergence of a new oligarchy of ultra-rich people. There always have been ultra-rich people in this country, but I'm afraid the 86 Act rather strongly increased that tendency, and you can see that in the data. Another thing that it did, by the way, since the only interest you could deduct after 86 was your mortgage, it encouraged people to buy homes in order to get credit, right, to run businesses. And so the increasing home ownership, which ultimately led to the mortgage crisis, had its origins in the way the 86 Act was drafted. Is this a good idea now? I would argue that it isn't. That fundamentally the important thing now is to go after the dynasties and oligarchy and plutocracy that we have developed in the last 30 years, and to create a further round of tax law that encourages the concentration of private wealth and the movement of wealth out of companies and to individuals is a bad idea, even if it might be good for the stock market, perhaps especially if it would be good for the stock market. There's a second piece of this proposal, which is to cut corporate tax rates and to cut them really hard. And the idea behind that is the old idea of supply-side economics, which was characterized by my dad as if you feed enough oats to the horses, some will be available post-processing for the sparrows. But is it true that a lower rate on the corporate income tax increases business investment? The answer to that is no, it's not true. You have to ask the question, why do corporations invest in the first place? The answer to that is they invest when they think there's profit in it, right? And it may make a bit of difference whether they get 90% of the profit or 65% of the profit. But if there's no profit, they don't invest. Because 90% of nothing is still nothing, and 65% of nothing is still nothing, right? And every business in America understands this. So there's no investment without growth, and there's no growth without growth of spending in the population. And if a tax cut is primarily oriented toward the rich, well, the rich are, they're as, who was it, Fitzgerald said, they're different from you and me because they have money. And so they don't adjust their spending to their income. They know what they want, they buy it already. Their income just piles up. It doesn't add materially, dramatically, significantly, dollar for dollar to their spending. You give a poor person money, well, that's more food on the table, that's a better house, that's an upgrade of living conditions, and that happens pretty quickly. A tax cut, which is primarily for the rich, is going to be very weak in its effect, and therefore it's going to be weak in its effect on spending, and therefore in its effect on growth, and therefore in its effect on profits, and therefore in its effect on investment. And making the retention rate, essentially, of those profits higher isn't going to change that calculation. And the third piece of the tax cut that's coming down the pike I consider to be extremely important, relates to the estate and gift tax. which they want to abolish. And the estate and gift tax is one of the great American institutions. It doesn't get the full-throated and wholehearted defense that it deserves. But when you look around this town or any town, and you find what are the leading institutions of the town, well, I can point out the University of Texas at Austin and all the other universities that are here and that decorate so many American cities, right? Ours being a particularly fine example. It's strongly supported by the estate and gift tax, by people who would rather have their name on a building or on a scholarship than have their estate either disappear to the government or pass on to their unworthy children. It's a problem of being very wealthy, is your children are much less worthy than you are, because you made $100 million and they're not the sort of people who can make $100 million. I don't think that's a big problem for this congregation, but it's something to be thankful for, actually. You have a better opinion of your children, I think, than many wealthy people do. Any event, look at what else do we have? Hospitals. Where do the hospitals get their buildings and their equipment? Well, a fair amount of it comes from people who benefited from that and who think it's worthwhile to be sponsors of medical facilities and medical research. Oh, and what about religious institutions? And what about cultural institutions? What about theaters? This is the way the country works. Right? And it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's actually, for many institutions, it means that they're really much better funded than are under nominally socialist systems where everybody's been subject to austerity for decades. And when you cut the budget, it really does cut the spending pattern, which isn't true so much if you've got multiple sources to which you can go. There are lots of defects with that system that we have, but it has its virtues. Getting rid of it for the sake of the misanthropic wealthy who do not wish to who want to build up dynasties and do not wish to pass their accumulations back to the community is, frankly, sociopathic. It is something which will undermine, over time, the structure of American society, and in my view, will undermine the place that wealthy people hold in our society, creating much more hostility than presently is the case. Much more. Because we do have a system in which there is an encouragement for wealthy people to spend, if they particularly have extreme accumulations, to spend a large part of their lives as philanthropists, for better or for worse. And that's something which is, you go around the world, you're not going to find it in very many other places. Very interesting point. Okay, so we are looking here at a tax bill which confirms what we know to be the case, which is that when there is a rebellion against the rule by an entitled professional class, the alternative is a class of self-serving rich people, oligarchs. Right. And you can see this in the Trump cabinet. Some of the most, least reputable billionaires of modern times are now taking a little time out to help themselves to the benefits of government. Although I take it Tom Price was a little bit indiscreet in how he did that. The other area that is interesting, and which is, I think, a product of the rebellion against entitled elites, and not entirely a bad thing, to be honest with you, is the downgrading of what one might call the professional foreign policy class, which had a very strong hold on democratic administrations. Civilian warriors from the Ivy Leagues coming in to show how tough they were by taking jobs at the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House, and going out to export democracy and human rights on the backs of the American soldier in the Middle East and elsewhere. In my view, this was not a good development. And it's not entirely clear that having foreign policy in the hands of professional generals is worse. they at least, and I began to feel this way when I encountered some of the leadership who were responsible for directing military operations in Iraq in the early 2000s, that their professional duty was above all to their institution, to the military, and that they were acutely conscious that if you assigned impossible tasks to the military, they would be damaged, not only in human terms, but in terms of the organizations and their capacity and their role in the society, and that this was not a good thing. And that being the case, well, what do we see? We see a policy of barking loud, but so far not that much biting. Someone described the policy with respect to North Korea as two dogs on either side of a chain link fence. Well, I can think of worse. I think we can see now that the Iran nuclear deal, which was a very important achievement, is probably going to survive. I say knock on wood, but just judging from the fact that it received the public support of the Secretary of Defense a few days ago, and a certain maneuver on the president's part to dump it in the lap of Congress was at least advertised or reported by the New York Times as indicating that after all is said and done, the deal will remain in place. We are no longer risking all that much in Syria in the face of rather clear-cut military realities. The embassy is still in Tel Aviv. And so far as I know, we haven't launched any or encouraged any reckless adventures in Ukraine or other places that could be quite dangerous. Should that hold, then the politics of the country will continue to turn on domestic developments. And I want to come back and close on this point to just discuss a few aspects of that, and that are related in some ways to the diagram that I have here of the rise of inequality and the evolution of the voting patterns. One thing I think is we're going to see that we will come to understand that the Democratic Party really did lose the last election primarily out of its own fault, out of its own failures, out of its own inability to craft a message that could span the divide between the coasts and the upper Midwest in particular, and that this was not a plot engineered by Vladimir Putin running nefarious Facebook ads about, among other things, there was something about dogs in those ads. Oh yes, it was a dog lovers page intended to attract your attention, and the political content was not entirely clear, but it was surely going to be inserted later. Well, anyway, these stories become increasingly preposterous as they develop, and there is an investigation going on, but if it results in no specific indictments for collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian officialdom, I will not be in the least surprised. There may be other indictments that one can find corruption of various kinds and money flows, illegitimate money flows, I don't doubt. But the notion that the Russian state was directing or coordinating with the Trump campaign seems to me to be something that we will discover has very little, if any, substance. The intelligence community's report on the subject, I recommend reading it. You can look at the appendix. It focuses exclusively, almost exclusively, on the television station RT, which is Russian. RT stands for Russia Today. It's not a secret what the television station is. It has a studio in Washington, D.C. It operates under color of U.S. law. And the intelligence community was clearly concerned that it was giving out a Russian line. Well, yes, okay. Fox News gives out a Murdoch line. Why are we surprised that television stations respond to the views of their owners? I don't know. In any event, that's that story. It isn't the fraction of it that reflects other things is minute. Second thing that's going on is that the ideas that were first presented to a large audience in the 2016 campaign, in particular by Bernie Sanders, are taking root. And this is something that anybody who worked on the congressional staff understands. You put it out an idea the first time, it's radical. 5 years later, it's mainstream. Right? You put them out in order to have the curing power of time and discussion. Medicare for all was a preposterous idea in 2015. It's now got a very substantial part, not only of the public, but of the political class, at least nominally behind it. It's got problems. It needs issues that need to be dealt with. Rural hospitals are going to have trouble if we go that way. But once the idea becomes the core idea, then you work out the details so that institutions can continue to operate, that you need can continue to operate under the new plan. So we may be moving finally in that direction, thanks to the way in which these ideas develop. And if that's the case, debt-free college is another example, the same phenomenon. If that's the case, then we may well see a modernized, strongly progressive Democratic candidate in 2020 as the alternative to a continuation of this regime. It'll be very interesting to see if that's the case, how it will play out. Will the centrists who so strongly opposed reforming the Democratic Party in 2016, will they support a Democratic campaign that they do not control? Will the money people stay on board, or will they go off and undermine it? We'll find out in due course. But I'll close on a question which I think is not necessarily a point which is not necessarily optimistic, which I think is worth bearing in mind and comes back to this analysis. What's happening in the middle of this chart? Two things. One is that the rise of inequality in the states that Trump won narrowly is actually decelerating. Why? Because their minority populations, their poor populations are shrinking, certainly as a share of the voters, and their rich populations are not growing. Those states are drifting away on this metric from the Democrats. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio has already gone long. Right? And that being so, it's going to be harder for a progressive Democratic candidate to carry those states in 2020 than it would have been for Sanders to carry them in 2016. So that's, I think, just a fact one has to, or at least a hypothesis, which, if true, is something we have to take into account. And the other piece is what's happening in the great arc of the South and Southwest. North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and Arizona in particular. Those states are becoming more unequal. They're drifting to the right on this diagram. Why? Because their cities are growing with a growing number of liberal, well-to-do professionals who are going to come over to the Democratic Party if they aren't already there, and growing numbers, rapidly growing numbers of immigrants of the Hispanic community, the African American community. And so the elements of a transformation in the South are also present. Texas, as we all know, gave 3-4 percentage points more of its vote to Hillary Clinton than it did to Barack Obama in 2012. Harris County, as we all know, went 100% Democratic, every office in the county in the last election. All of the Texas cities are increasingly in Democratic hands. So the state is changing along with the others, and in an interesting way. Will either of these trends be decisive in 2020? I don't know. I find that it's possible that we fall short. That if you're a progressive, you fall short on both counts. You lose the upper Midwest by a larger margin than this time around, and you lose the South by a smaller margin than the last time around, but you don't quite make it on either score. Well, that's a possibility. And the other possibility, of course, is that progressive forces actually get their act together and work like hell and overcome the odds. And we'll see which of those possibilities pans out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Galbraith.
A question occurs to me about a change over a number of decades where the Republican Party has been very effective in taking over state and local government. At the same time, there's been a shift in demographics that the liberal categories hope will help their vote. But something's happening along with this shift along with the taking over of these state governments, and that's a move for a constitutional convention. And at this point, it feels to me like the Republican Party is in a race to get that convention and change the rules of the game enough to continue even in the light of the demographic shift.
I'm aware of the drive for a constitutional convention. I suspect that there would still be some legal hurdles because the first states to approve one, that's a long time ago now. So the question of how long these petitions are valid, I think, would have to be adjudicated. But if you're right, and if 3 more states call for a convention, and if one is convened, I suspect that the legitimacy of the resulting document would endanger the illegitimacy of the resulting document in many people's eyes would endanger the continuity of the country as a whole. We exist under the Constitution that was ratified in, 1793. All right, so we are, am I right? 1789 is the Constitution. Okay, for the radio audience, we will rule that I was correct on whichever date I specified. And if that document is trashed by a convention whose purpose is to destroy the basis of effective popular sovereignty, or even the fiction of it, under which we presently live, and we tolerate a great many things, gerrymandering. We tolerate the fact that the 55 million people of California have 2 senators, and 21 states that don't add up to that number have 42 senators. We tolerate the bias in the Electoral College. We tolerate a lot of things that impair the voice of the people on democratic matters. We tolerate the role of private money. All of these things, we continue to call ourselves a democracy in spite of all of this. If you went that step beyond and tore down the Constitution in order to permanently enshrine the kind of control that the advocates of that would like, I think the country itself would stand a very serious risk of coming apart in a few years. I don't see why people would stand for it at all.
I don't know if you and your economic team are factoring in the massive amounts of money that are going to be consumed by our climate change and global warming initiatives that are swamping budgets, fires, tornadoes. Seems like only during hurricane season do they talk about these things, but worldwide we're seeing massive evacuations and immigration because of the effects of climate. Is your team in any way dealing with that? Because it doesn't seem like our administration is at all.
It's clearly the challenge that will have to be taken up as soon as we have a functioning government. My own team, which consists of myself and 2 doctoral students, is pretty limited in terms of what it can do, but I fully agree with you. I hope for every economist you have on this podium, you have 3 or 4 people who can tell you something serious about what's going on with the climate.
Much the same as in astronomy, when they talk about hundreds of billions of light years, it kind of goes out of the mind. When we talk about hundreds of billions of dollars in the federal budget, people just lose track. There's $1,000 million in $1 billion. So there doesn't seem to be enough illustrations in the public sphere to help people understand the vast, unbelievable and inconceivable disparity between the vast majority of Americans and that crazy oligarchic minority at the top.
Well, yes, the scale of government is very large. It should be. The point of having a government in a large country is in part to provide essential services to every man, woman, and child in the country. It is to provide education, health care, to assist with stable and secure housing, to provide and protect the environment. All of these things are important functions and have to be carried out at a continental scale in this country. We're a very large country. I don't think we should be ashamed to have a large government. A universal social insurance program funnels a lot of money through the government, but it's in fact a cheap and efficient way of providing insurance. Social Security has an extremely low administrative cost. This is not true of employer-provided health care insurance. Right? The job of Medicare is to provide the benefits that are specified under law. The job of a private insurance company is to collect premiums and to delay payments. I was let in on that secret by a friend who worked for one, but I guess it's a pretty ill-disguised secret. So.
Dr. Galbraith, I'm sure you saw the data this week. I believe it's released by the Census Bureau, and that is of, once again, income inequality in Americans. And this dealt with data, part of it was broken by, quote, race, and it revealed that white families, on average, being the mean, had a wealth accumulation of $930,000. That was the mean. However, the median for those same families was $170,000, revealing a huge gap between these two averages. With those tremendous gaps in that accumulation of wealth at the top, what dangers does that pose to us?
Let's be clear that those numbers, as I understand them, do refer to financial wealth. Yes? And financial wealth is not the only or even the most important kind. The most important form of wealth for most Americans actually is home equity. It's not a liquid financial asset, the value in your house. And perhaps more important than that for all Americans, including those who don't own homes, is the value of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, of the public programs to which you have access and which provide a form of security. So you can ask yourself, at a rate of interest of 2%, what would be the bond that you would accept in exchange for your Social Security benefit? It'd be a pretty big bond, actually. It'd be a pretty big bond. That program doesn't show up on the books as financial wealth, but it's a crucial program in assuring that every family that has a work record in this country has a basic support in retirement, disability, and their survivors. Very, very vital. Now, what's the issue with financial wealth? Financial wealth in a capitalist society is going to be held by a small number of people. I think we can take that. You want a different society, you can have a different dispensation, but thus it always was if you have a private enterprise society. The difficulty of it is very straightforward. And Adam Smith in 1776 expressed it in the shortest and best sentence in the entire Wealth of Nations. He said, "Wealth is power, as Mr. Hobbes says." I just love that, as Mr. Hobbes says. All right? This is the issue. Do we want the government in the hands of people who buy it with money? The answer to that, I think, is no. And for that reason, one has to be very, attentive to the excessive accumulation of financial wealth. That's the main reason in my view.
A recent Planet Money podcast polled 6 economists on the subject of the corporate income tax, and they were unanimous that the corporate income tax should be eliminated, and the income from corporations, dividends, and capital gains should be taxed as ordinary income. Could you comment, please?
Well, I don't see why that should be the case. There's double taxation everywhere. Should the sales tax be eliminated because you get? Sales tax should be eliminated, of course, but should you get taxed on your income, and then it's taxed again when you buy something? What's the big deal here? If there's some reason why this would lead to a better dispensation, I'm all for it, but I don't have any reason to believe that's the case. I discussed that earlier. Would you get a wave of business investment? Well, so the nominal corporate tax rate is higher in the United States than it is in parts of Europe. But do they have a higher rate of business investment than we do? No, they don't. They're in stagnation.
I think the idea was that the corporate income tax is a fixed percentage, but the personal income tax is taxed very aggressively.
It may be a fixed percentage. Of course, if the corporate stock is owned by an institution which is tax exempt, then that which might well become universal case. You would not get any revenue from that at all. So there's that to think about. But the reality is that corporate stock is owned by wealthy people. So this is not. It's not just a question of their annual income. It's a question of their wealth position. All right? Many people who have high wealth don't have any real need for income. So there's I think that's another consideration. Now, I'm in favor of a broad-based tax on many income streams that provides a stable foundation. It's not so much funding for the government as it's a foundation for the monetary system. The tax system is the reason why the dollar is the strong currency in the world, is that there is a strong reason if you work in this economy to hold and use that, which isn't true in a country which doesn't tax effectively. People in Brazil or Argentina quickly put all their money in other currencies.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Dr. Galbraith, thank you so much for this scintillating and challenging presentation. Thank you for your great academic work and your perspective. And thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much.